The parking garage swallowed sound like a living thing. Sesshomaru materialized in the center of level 3, his hakama dissolving into wisps of demonic energy as the dimensional rift snapped shut behind him. The transition was violent, not the graceful step between worlds he'd experienced before, but a tearing, a wrenching that left his senses screaming. The air here was wrong. Thick with iron and electricity, suffocating in its strangeness. His poison claws extended reflexively, glowing faintly in the darkness, casting sickly green light across concrete and steel. Sesshomaru. Rin materialized 3 feet away, tumbling forward onto the cold pavement. She was unhurt, his barrier had protected her during the crossing, but her eyes were wide with confusion and fear. Sesshomaru moved to her instantly, lifting her into his arms without ceremony. She clung to him, small and trembling, her kimono pristine despite the journey. "Where are we?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He did not answer immediately. His senses were stretched thin, trying to process the overwhelming input. Above them, in the levels above and below, he could feel presences. Human, mostly, but threaded through with something else. Power. Not demonic, but present nonetheless. It was like standing in an entirely different hierarchy, one that operated on principles he didn't yet understand. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with an intensity that made his teeth ache. The smell of motor oil, rubber, and something caustic filled his nostrils. Vehicles, crude metal boxes with internal combustion engines, sat dormant in the shadows. But it was the iron in the very structure of this place that made his skin crawl. Iron mixed with something else, something that conducted electricity and disrupted the flow of his demonic aura. Sesshomaru set Rin down carefully, keeping one clawed hand on her shoulder. "Stay close." His voice was steady, betraying none of the dissonance he felt. "This is not the realm we knew." A sound echoed through the garage, footsteps, rapid and purposeful. A human emerged from between 2 vehicles, a woman in her 50s with keys in one hand and a purse in the other. She took 3 steps forward before her brain processed what stood before her, a pale, ethereal man in an antique kimono, his long silver hair catching the fluorescent light like spun glass, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her bladder nearly give out. Next to him was a child in equally impossible clothing. The woman opened her mouth to scream. Sesshomaru's demonic aura flared, subtle, controlled, but absolute. The woman's scream died in her throat. Her hand trembled, her keys dropped, and she backed away slowly, her survival instinct screaming at her to flee. She did, stumbling over her own feet as she ran toward the stairwell. Rin tugged on his sleeve. "Sesshomaru, people are scared of us." "Yes." He watched the woman disappear. "Because we do not belong here." The parking garage had a single entrance that led to a street. Sesshomaru could hear traffic, the grinding of large vehicles, the honking of horns, the endless murmur of human activity. Whatever this place was, it was vast and teeming with life. The dimensional rift that had torn through both worlds had pulled him and Rin through, but it had sealed itself completely. He could feel the absence of the path home like a missing limb. There, somewhere, but inaccessible. He looked down at Rin. "We will need to adapt." She nodded, trusting him completely. That trust was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous vulnerability. They walked toward the street level, Sesshomaru's senses screaming in protest with every step. The world beyond the parking garage was an assault of stimulus. Tall buildings of glass and steel stretched toward a sky obscured by pollution. Humans moved in rivers along the sidewalks, dressed in strange, revealing clothes. Vehicles roared past, their headlights cutting through the humid afternoon air. And everywhere, was that constant hum of electricity, that wrongness in the ley lines that made his demonic power feel sluggish and distant. A young man walking past them stopped, staring. Sesshomaru locked eyes with him and felt the man's mind recoil. The human walked faster, crossing the street without looking back. "Sesshomaru," Rin whispered. "Your eyes. They're showing." He understood immediately. In this world, with these humans, his true nature would be a liability. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing his demonic presence inward, dampening it to something almost manageable. When he opened them again, they appeared almost normal, gold flecks in a pale iris, unsettling but not obviously inhuman. It required constant concentration, like holding his breath indefinitely. "We need shelter," he said quietly. "And we need to understand what this place is." They walked deeper into the city, St. Louis revealing itself in layers. The riverfront with its massive arch. The downtown district with its imposing towers. The smell of the Mississippi River mixing with car exhaust. And everywhere, the constant presence of other supernatural beings. Sesshomaru could feel them now that he was attuned to it, vampires in sealed buildings, shapeshifters moving through the crowd, humans with traces of preternatural power moving with purpose and authority. This was not a city governed by demon lords. This was a city with its own power structure, one he did not understand and could not immediately dominate. Rin held his hand as they walked, her small fingers trusting in his grip. She asked questions. What were the tall buildings, why were the humans so rude, where would they sleep, but Sesshomaru barely heard her. His mind was working on a problem he'd never faced before, survival in a world where his power meant nothing. By nightfall, they'd found a small, shabby hotel in a neighborhood that asked no questions and took cash. The proprietor barely looked at them, too absorbed in a television screen to notice anything unusual about his new guests. The room was small, with stained carpet and a bed that smelled vaguely of despair, but it had a lock on the door and a window that overlooked an alley. Sesshomaru sat by that window for hours after Rin fell asleep, watching the city pulse with nocturnal life. Somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond his understanding, was a way home. But first, he would need to learn how to survive in this realm of science and strange magic. And he would need to keep Rin safe, no matter what it cost him. Morning came with the sound of traffic and distant sirens. Sesshomaru hadn't slept, he'd spent the night in meditation, trying to understand the ley lines of this world, attempting to chart the flow of power beneath the concrete and steel. It was like trying to read an ancient text written in a language he'd never encountered. The patterns were there, but they made no sense. Rin woke with the sun, stretching and yawning before the reality of their situation crashed down on her small face. "Can we go home today?" she asked hopefully, already knowing the answer. "Not today," Sesshomaru said. It was a kindness, technically a lie. He didn't know if they could go home at all. They needed supplies. Food, though Sesshomaru had little interest in it. Clothing that didn't scream, feudal Japan. Information. The last was most critical, understanding the power structure of this city and where they fit into it, if anywhere. Sesshomaru dressed Rin in clothes purchased from a street vendor. Jeans, a t-shirt, shoes that felt wrong on her feet. He kept his own kimono but added a long coat that obscured most of it, and found sunglasses that helped hide his eyes. He looked like a wealthy eccentric, which was close enough to the truth. Rin looked like a lost child, which was also true. They ate breakfast at a small diner, Rin with enthusiasm, Sesshomaru with mechanical necessity. The waitress who served them kept glancing at them with a mixture of concern and curiosity. At one point, she leaned toward a coworker and said something about calling someone, but Sesshomaru's presence made her think better of it. Fear was a useful tool, though using it constantly would draw unwanted attention. The question was, who would come? They found out faster than anticipated. Sesshomaru and Rin were walking through Lafayette Park in the afternoon, Rin chasing pigeons while Sesshomaru observed the neighborhood around them, when he sensed them. Three presences, converging from different directions, moving. With purpose. They weren't human, or rather, they had been, but something in them had changed. Supernatural. Powerful, but not nearly as powerful as he was, even weakened by this world's interference. The first one approached from the left, a man in his 30s with the bearing of a predator. The second came from behind, a woman with scarred knuckles and cold eyes. The third blocked their path forward, younger, with the restless energy of something that had never learned control. "Hello," the first one said, smiling without warmth. "You're new to town. I'm Marcus. We like to know who's operating in our territory." Sesshomaru didn't recognize the term operating, but he understood the subtext clearly. This was a territorial challenge, dressed in the language of civility. The three beings reeked of something, not quite vampire, not quite human. The smell was familiar enough that it took him a moment to place it: animal. Shapeshifters. "I am not operating," Sesshomaru said quietly. "I am passing through." Marcus's smile widened. "That's funny. You don't look like someone who passes through anywhere. You look like someone who does what he wants and doesn't ask permission." He moved closer, and Sesshomaru could smell the wolf beneath his skin, barely restrained. That kind of attitude gets people hurt in St. Louis. Rin moved closer to Sesshomaru, sensing the danger even if she didn't fully understand it. Sesshomaru placed a hand on her head, a gesture of possession and protection that would have been unmistakable to any preternatural being. "The child is mine," Sesshomaru said. "Anyone who threatens her will die." It was said with such absolute certainty, such calm finality, that for a moment even the shapeshifters hesitated. Then Marcus laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Oh, I like you," Marcus said. "You've got confidence. That's either going to get you killed or get you noticed by people more important than us." He gestured to his companions, and they began to circle. A classic predator's maneuver. "Richard, that's our pack leader, he's going to want to meet you. Either you come willingly, or we bring you. Your choice, but the kid stays with you. Those are the rules." Sesshomaru assessed the situation with crystalline clarity. Fighting them would be simple, even weakened, he could slaughter all three in seconds. But it would draw attention, and attention in this strange city was a liability when he didn't understand the rules. More importantly, these shapeshifters knew something he needed: the structure of power in St. Louis. They operated within it, answered to someone called Richard, and represented a faction distinct from whatever other supernatural entities lurked in this place. "Lead the way," Sesshomaru said. Marcus's grin was satisfied. "Smart. Come on." They were led through the city to a neighborhood called the Delmar Loop, a mixture of trendy shops and older buildings that seemed to serve as some kind of cultural hub. The shapeshifters brought them to a building that smelled like animals and old magic, a nightclub called Guilty Pleasures. Even in daylight, Sesshomaru could sense the supernatural weight of the place. This was a den of power, a place where the rules were different and danger was currency. Inside, the club was dim and musty, still being cleaned from the previous night's activities. But it was occupied. A man in his late 30s, with the bearing of natural authority, emerged from the back. He had the scent of both wolf and something else, human, but carrying the weight of multiple forms. This was Richard, Sesshomaru understood immediately. Not the most powerful in the room, but wielding significant authority. "So you're the mysterious stranger causing a stir in the park," Richard said, studying Sesshomaru with careful eyes. "Marcus says you've got power. Preternatural power." "I am what your language would call a demon," Sesshomaru said, deciding that deception would be pointless. These creatures could sense lies in heartbeat and scent. "I am not here by choice. I am here because a dimensional rift pulled me and my ward into this world." The term dimensional rift seemed to mean nothing to Richard, but demon registered. The shapeshifter's hand went instinctively to his side, where Sesshomaru sensed the presence of iron and silver, weapons designed to harm supernatural beings. "A demon," Richard repeated. "That's what you're claiming?" "That is what I am stating as fact." Richard studied him for a long moment, then gestured to one of his pack members. Get Jean-Claude. And call Anita Blake. I think RPIT needs to know about this. Sesshomaru didn't know what RPIT meant, but the name Anita Blake, spoken with a mixture of respect and wariness, suggested she was someone of significance. Another power structure, then. Another faction he would need to navigate. Rin tugged on his sleeve. Sesshomaru, what's happening? We are being presented to the governing powers of this city, he said quietly. I believe we are about to discover exactly how much danger we are in. She looked up at him, her child's face trusting despite the circumstances. Sesshomaru felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle deeper into his chest. Whatever came next, whatever negotiations or confrontations or revelations awaited them, he would ensure her safety. That was the only law that mattered. The clock on the wall of guilty pleasures ticked past 3 in the afternoon. Somewhere in St. Louis, people were being called, told that something impossible had arrived in their city. Something old and powerful that didn't belong to any known faction. Something that would change everything. Anita Blake arrived 40 minutes later, and Sesshomaru's first impression was of controlled danger wrapped in a human frame. She was small, barely over 5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and the kind of posture that suggested she'd spent considerable time training with weapons. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. They were brown, unremarkable at first glance, but behind them moved a mind that was calculating, assessing, and utterly unimpressed by his presence. She wore jeans and a leather jacket, and beneath it, Sesshomaru could sense the weight of firearms and other instruments of violence. So you're the demon, she said by way of greeting, not bothering with pleasantries. Richard called me 20 minutes ago. He seemed to think you were worth my time. Your name precedes you, Sesshomaru replied. Apparently, you are a person of authority in this city. Anita's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. I'm a federal marshal specializing in preternatural crimes, and I have a working relationship with the supernatural community. That doesn't make me an authority. It makes me a referee. She gestured to Richard. Why don't we all sit down and you explain what exactly a demon is doing in St. Louis with a child in tow? They adjourned to a private room in Guilty Pleasures, and Sesshomaru found himself seated at a table across from Anita, with Richard and 2 of his pack members flanking him. Rin sat pressed against his side, her small hand gripping his sleeve. A camera had been set up in the corner, Sesshomaru noted it immediately. This interrogation was being recorded. I will answer your questions, Sesshomaru began, his voice measured and precise, but first, I will establish the terms of this conversation. The child is not to be separated from me under any circumstances. Any attempt to restrain me or remove her will result in consequences you are not prepared for. I am telling you this not as a threat, but as fact. Anita leaned back in her chair, studying him. You've got presence, I'll give you that. But here's what you need to understand, you're in my city, you're in front of a federal officer, and you're threatening me. That's not how this works. I am not threatening, Sesshomaru said calmly. I am stating boundaries. In my world, boundaries are respected. I have gathered that your world operates differently. However, my commitment to the child's safety is not negotiable. The child has a name? Anita asked. Rin. And she is? My ward. Orphaned. I have raised her since she was small. Anita glanced at Richard, who nodded slightly. Whatever silent communication passed between them, it seemed to satisfy her somewhat. Okay. Tell me about the dimensional rift. How did you get here? What were you doing when it happened? Sesshomaru recounted the events leading to their arrival. The pursuit of a rogue demon using fragments of the Shirkan jewel, the confrontation that destabilized the barrier between worlds, the violent crossing. He was precise in his details, offering no unnecessary elaboration but withholding nothing that might be relevant. Anita asked questions with the efficiency of someone accustomed to extracting information from hostile sources. So you're saying this Shirkan jewel is a source of power, Anita said. And these fragments are still out there? Possibly. I cannot sense them in this world. The interference from your technology and infrastructure obscures my ability to track them. What kind of demon are you, exactly? This question came from one of Richard's pack members, a woman with intricate tattoos visible on her neck and arms. Vampire? Werewolf? Something else? I am what your anthropologists would call a yokai, a demon of the old world, Sesshomaru said. I do not transform. I am this form, permanently. I possess regenerative abilities, heightened physical capabilities, and command over certain forms of demonic energy. I am also weakened by prolonged exposure to the iron and electromagnetic interference present in this city. How weakened? Anita asked. Functionally at approximately 85% capacity. My regeneration operates at reduced efficiency. My demonic aura is suppressed by the ley line structure of your world. My ability to access certain forms of power is limited. Sesshomaru watched Anita process this information. She was dangerous in a different way than the demons he'd fought in his own world. Not more powerful, perhaps, but more clever. More willing to work within systems and constraints. He recognized in her a kinship with his own approach to governance, pragmatism wrapped in principle. So what do you want? Anita asked. Are you looking for a way home? Are you planning to establish yourself here? What's your endgame? My endgame is survival, Sesshomaru said. I will find a way home if one exists. In the interim, I require a stable location, access to information, and assurance that Rin will not be used as leverage by other factions. Other factions, Anita repeated. You mean the Vampire Council? And possibly others. I do not yet know the extent of the factions operating in this city. Anita stood, pacing to the window. Outside, St. Louis sprawled in the afternoon light. Okay. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me to the police station, our PIT headquarters. We're going to do a formal intake, process you as a preternatural entity, and establish some ground rules for your presence in this city. You cooperate, you follow the law, and you don't go around killing people or threatening civilians. Do that, and you get basic protection under the law. And if I refuse? Sesshomaru asked. Then I call in backup, we try to contain you magically, and it gets messy for everyone involved. I'd prefer to avoid that, because honestly, I don't know if magic that works on werewolves and vampires would work on a demon from another dimension. But I've got resources, and I'm not afraid to use them. There was no bluff in her voice. Sesshomaru sensed the truth of her words. She would indeed attempt to contain him if he refused, and while he could likely overcome such an attempt, it would be costly and would draw far more attention than he wanted. Better to work within the system, at least initially. Very well, he said. I accept your terms, provisionally. Anita's eyebrow arched. Provisionally. I reserve the right to modify my cooperation if circumstances change in a manner I deem unacceptable. A smile flickered across Anita's face, genuine amusement this time. I think we're going to get along just fine, actually. Come on. Let's get you officially integrated into St. Louis's supernatural database. The next few hours were a blur of bureaucratic processing that Sesshomaru found both absurd and illuminating. He was photographed, fingerprinted, and subjected to a battery of tests designed to measure his preternatural capabilities. A vampire named Jean-Claude was called in, a man with dark hair and older European elegance, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. He studied Sesshomaru with undisguised interest. A demon, Jean-Claude mused, his French accent barely noticeable. I have heard rumors of such beings, but I have never encountered one. Tell me, does your species feed on humans? No, Sesshomaru said flatly. I do not require human flesh or blood to survive. That seemed to disappoint Jean-Claude somewhat, though he recovered quickly. The vampire consulted with Anita in rapid French, too fast for Sesshomaru to follow despite his understanding of the language. Whatever they discussed seemed to conclude that he was not an immediate threat to the established vampire hierarchy. By the time evening fell, Sesshomaru and Rin had been processed, catalogued, and conditionally accepted as a new variable in St. Louis's supernatural ecosystem. They were given a temporary address, a safe house maintained by RPIT for preternatural entities requiring secure housing, and warned extensively about the consequences of violating local laws. As they were leaving the police station, Anita walked them out. One more thing, she said. Word travels fast in the supernatural community. By tomorrow, every faction in the city will know you're here. Some of them will want to recruit you. Some will want to eliminate you as a potential threat. My advice? Don't go anywhere alone, keep the kid close, and don't trust anyone who approaches you with promises of help or power. I do not require advice, Sesshomaru said. Maybe not. But you're in a world you don't understand, playing by rules you don't know, and every supernatural faction in this city is going to see you as either an opportunity or a problem. So take it from someone who's been in your position, knowledge is your best weapon right now. Sesshomaru considered this. The woman had a point, much as he disliked admitting it. Your counsel is noted. As he and Rin walked through the humid St. Louis night toward their temporary sanctuary, Sesshomaru felt the weight of factions closing in. The Vampire Council would move soon. The shapeshifter pack would attempt to manipulate him. There would be hunters, dark mages, and entities he couldn't yet imagine. But for now, Rin was safe. And that was the only calculation that mattered. The safe house was a nondescript two-story building in a quiet neighborhood, indistinguishable from the dozen others on the street. Sesshomaru appreciated its anonymity even as he despised its vulnerability. No demon lord's estate in his world would have been so exposed. But Rapid's choice of location was strategic, visible enough that Anita's organization could monitor it, isolated enough that neighbors wouldn't ask questions. Rin fell asleep almost immediately after they arrived, exhausted by the day's upheaval. Sesshomaru sat in the darkened living room, a cup of untouched tea on the table before him, and meditated on the problem of survival in an alien world. The knock on the door came at 2 a.m. Sesshomaru's eyes opened. He hadn't been asleep, sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford in unfamiliar territory. His senses had been stretched throughout the house, monitoring Rin, monitoring the streets, monitoring the subtle shifts in the supernatural ley lines that pulsed beneath the city. This visitor was not human. Vampire, certainly. But there was something else to the presence, an ancient power, carefully contained, radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Sesshomaru rose without sound and opened the door. Jean-Claude stood on the threshold, impeccably dressed despite the hour, his dark eyes reflecting the streetlight like a predator's. Behind him waited two vampire thralls, humans whose will had been subsumed into the vampire's commands, visible by the marks on their necks that identified them as blood-bonded. Good evening, Jean-Claude said, his French accent making the words into poetry. I hope I did not disturb you. You did not disturb me, Sesshomaru said. You disturbed the peace that Anita Blake's agreement promised. Enter, or state your business from the threshold. Choose quickly. Jean-Claude's smile widened appreciatively. Direct. I like this. May I come inside? Sesshomaru stepped aside. Jean-Claude's thralls remained outside, a courtesy that Sesshomaru recognized. The vampire wanted this conversation private, which meant whatever he was about to propose might be considered improper by Anita's standards. They sat across from each other in the living room. Jean-Claude declined the offer of refreshment with a gesture. I have been governing the vampire population of St. Louis for nearly 20 years, he began without preamble. It is a delicate balance. The Vampire Council in Europe, the Ulfric, the Wolf King, Richard, the human government, and various other preternatural entities. You are a variable I did not anticipate. Then you should have anticipated more carefully, Sesshomaru said. Perhaps. Jean-Claude leaned back in his chair. However, what is done is done. The question now is, how do you fit into this ecosystem? You are not vampire. You are not shapeshifter. You claim to be demon, which means you do not belong to any established faction. That is accurate. Which makes you dangerous, Jean-Claude continued. Anita Blake is powerful, but she is bound by law and morality. Richard rules the shapeshifters, but he is weak, torn between human conscience and wolf nature. The Vampire Council is distant and concerned primarily with maintaining the status quo. But you are an unknown quantity. A being of significant power operating outside the established hierarchy. Sesshomaru understood immediately what the vampire was proposing. You want me to align with your faction. I want to offer you a position of prominence within my organization, Jean-Claude said carefully. A place where your power would be recognized and utilized. You would have access to resources, protection, and the kind of authority you deserve. In exchange, you would agree to support my interests and the interests of the Vampire Council. And if I refuse? Then I will have to assume you are either working toward your own faction, which would be a threat to the established order, or that you are unstable and unpredictable. Either way, steps would be taken to contain that threat. It was a veiled declaration of war, wrapped in courteous language. Sesshomaru appreciated the honesty of it. If you move against me or mine, you will regret it. I do not doubt it, Jean-Claude said. However, there are more of us than there are of you. And while your power is considerable, even at reduced capacity, you are still weakened by this world's interference. Calculation suggests that a coordinated attack by my organization and allied factions would have a 70% probability of success. Calculation suggests you would lose half your vampire population in the attempt, Sesshomaru countered. And you would not survive it. That is the mathematics that matter. Jean-Claude stood, and for a moment, genuine fear flickered across his ancient features. It was there and gone in an instant, the vampire reasserting control over his primal instincts. You have 24 hours to consider my offer. After that, I will assume your answer is no, and I will proceed accordingly. He left with the same courteous formality he'd arrived with, his thralls moving to flank him as he walked back toward the night. Sesshomaru waited until he sensed the vampire's presence fade from the neighborhood before closing the door. Rin appeared at the top of the stairs, her small face pale. Sesshomaru. What happened? Politics, he said simply. Come. You should sleep. But neither of them slept for the remainder of the night. Instead, Sesshomaru held Rin while she dozed fitfully, and he thought about the nature of power in this world. In his realm, power flowed from strength. From the ability to overcome opposition, from the mastery of demonic arts, from the accumulation of territory and subordinates. But here, power seemed to flow from organization, from the manipulation of law and authority, from the willingness to sacrifice numbers of lesser beings for strategic gain. It was a different calculus entirely. By morning, Richard had sent an emissary, a lean, intense woman named Sylvie with the bearing of a military officer. She didn't try to be subtle about her purpose. The Ulfric wants to meet with you, she said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. We have an understanding with Anita Blake about neutral ground. There's a restaurant, open to the public but discreet, where we can talk without drawing attention. Sesshomaru agreed, as much out of strategic curiosity as anything else. He needed to understand the full extent of the factions operating in this city, and direct conversation was more efficient than observation alone. Rin insisted on coming with him, despite his preference to leave her at the safe house. In the end, he acquiesced. She was safer with him than anyone else in this city, and his presence with her would communicate a message to whatever factions he encountered. The restaurant was called Delilah's, and it occupied a corner building in a neighborhood that had clearly seen better days. Inside, the lighting was dim, the booths were private, and the staff seemed thoroughly unsurprised by the presence of preternatural beings. Richard waited in a back booth with two of his pack members flanking him like guards. "I appreciate you coming," Richard said, gesturing for Sesshomaru and Rin to sit. Rin slid into the booth first, followed by Sesshomaru, who remained alert and ready for violence. "Jean-Claude made his position clear last night," Sesshomaru said, not bothering with preliminary politeness. "I assume you are here to make yours." Richard's jaw tightened. "You met with Jean-Claude alone?" "He invited himself. I answered the door. That is all." "Did you agree to anything?" "No." Richard seemed to relax slightly. "Good. Listen, I'm not going to insult your intelligence with flowery offers. Jean-Claude wants you as a weapon. I want you as an ally. There's a difference." He leaned forward. "The Vampire Council has been consolidating power in this city for the last 2 decades. They've pushed the shapeshifter community to the margins. They control the human government through manipulation and blackmail. They're moving toward absolute dominance. And you want me to prevent that," Sesshomaru said. "I want you to understand the situation so you can make your own decisions about where you stand," Richard corrected. "The Wolf Pack isn't as organized or as ruthless as the Vampire Council. But we have numbers, we have loyalty, and we understand that power shared is power secured. If you choose to work with us, you'd have a voice in major decisions. You'd be treated as a partner, not a tool." Rin tugged on Sesshomaru's sleeve. "What's the wolf man saying?" "He is attempting to recruit me against the vampires," Sesshomaru explained, not bothering to lower his voice. "He believes the Vampire Council is a threat that must be balanced." Richard's expression was complicated, part frustration, part resignation. "Yeah. Something like that." The meal was ordered, though Sesshomaru ate little and Rin picked at her food nervously. The conversation continued in the careful dance of preternatural politics, information traded for information, positions clarified, boundaries established. By the end of it, Sesshomaru had extracted a comprehensive understanding of St. Louis's supernatural hierarchy. Jean-Claude and the Vampire Council wielded the most centralized power, but they were distant, preferring to rule through intermediaries. Richard and the Shapeshifter Pack were numerous but fractured, fighting internal disputes about whether to embrace their animal nature or maintain human identity. Anita Blake existed outside the traditional hierarchy, a federal authority with both preternatural power and human legal backing, making her simultaneously useful to everyone and trusted by no one. And then there were the others. Independent operators. Dark mages. Rogue vampires. Hunters with religious conviction. The supernatural underworld that operated in the shadows, bound by no faction, answerable to no authority. As Sesshomaru and Rin walked back toward their safe house in the afternoon sun, he felt the weight of the city pressing down on him like an enormous stone. In his world, he was the demon lord of the western lands. Power flowed from his will. Subjects obeyed through fear and respect. But here, he was a stranger in an unknown game, and the pieces were already in motion around him. Rin looked up at him. "Sesshomaru, when can we go home?" He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. All he could do was protect her and navigate the dangerous waters of this city's supernatural politics until he found a way back. Or until the factions stopped asking nicely and started demanding answers in blood. 3 days passed in a careful balance of negotiation and reconnaissance. Sesshomaru established a routine, mornings spent with Rin, teaching her to navigate this strange city while keeping her grounded in the memories of their old world. Afternoons devoted to mapping the supernatural landscape, visiting locations where he could feel the concentration of preternatural power, identifying choke points and sanctuaries, understanding the geometry of authority that governed St. Louis. Evenings brought complications. The first direct territorial challenge came from a faction Sesshomaru hadn't anticipated, independent shapeshifters operating outside Richard's pack structure. They found him and Rin at a park near their safe house, a deliberate choice on their part to demonstrate their willingness to violate the agreements Anita Blake had brokered. There were 5 of them, all bearing the marks of hard-lived lives. One had a scar that split his face vertically, dividing eye from eye. Another had fingers that bent at wrong angles, suggesting repeated breaks that hadn't healed correctly. They moved with the predatory grace of beings that spent more time in animal form than human. The Ulfrics got no jurisdiction over us, the scarred one said, stepping between Sesshomaru and the path that would lead away from the park. We heard there's a new player in town. Someone with power. Someone not bound to any faction. He smiled, and it was an expression of pure predation. That makes you either competition or opportunity. Sesshomaru didn't bother with words. He simply extended his hand, let his claws extend slightly, and allowed his demonic aura to flare. It was a controlled display, not full power, which would have drawn official attention, but enough to demonstrate his capability. The electromagnetic interference of the city was still present, still dampening his true strength, but even at 85%, he was more than these rogue shapeshifters could handle. The scarred one's confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. That hesitation was all that was needed. Sesshomaru moved, not attacking, but positioning himself between them and Rin, his body language making it clear that any approach would result in immediate lethal response. The rogue shapeshifters exchanged glances, reassessing. What had seemed like an opportunity, a powerful outsider to test or recruit, suddenly looked like a potential extinction event. Tell your masters, Sesshomaru said quietly, that the child is not to be approached. Anyone who fails to respect that boundary will be removed from this world permanently. The scarred shapeshifter laughed, but it was nervous now. You're making enemies pretty quick, demon. I am establishing necessary boundaries, Sesshomaru corrected. Your survival depends on respecting them. They left, and Rin pressed against Sesshomaru's side, shaking slightly. Are they gone? Yes. And they will not return. But the incident was significant in ways that extended beyond the immediate confrontation. By nightfall, Anita Blake had called him directly. A phone number left at the safe house for emergencies had proven useful after all. She wanted a meeting at RPIT headquarters, and her tone suggested this was not optional. The Federal Preternatural Investigation Team's headquarters was located in an older government building downtown, all concrete and institutional efficiency. Anita met him in an interrogation room, not as dramatic a choice as it could have been, but the subtext was clear. This was official business. You've been busy, she said without preamble, sliding a file across the table. Inside were photographs of the rogue shapeshifters, along with reports of their activities over the years. Gang violence. Murder. Rape. A litany of crimes that had gone unpunished because they operated outside the formal pack structure. They approached me, Sesshomaru said. I discouraged their interest. With threats of violence. With clear statement of boundaries and the implicit capacity to enforce them. Anita leaned back in her chair, studying him. There was no judgment in her eyes, which was perhaps the most interesting thing about the interaction. Here's the problem. Those guys are independently wealthy and connected to people who don't like their criminal enterprises being interrupted. You just marked yourself as someone willing to stand against them. That makes you either an ally worth cultivating or an enemy worth eliminating, depending on their assessment. I am aware of the calculus. Are you? Anita's voice hardened. Because from where I'm sitting, you're making moves in a game you don't fully understand. You're strong, I don't doubt that. But strength isn't everything in this city. You've got vampire council politics, shapeshifter hierarchy, religious extremists with serious firepower, dark mages, rogue vampires, and about a dozen other factions all circling you now. Jean-Claude wants you. Richard's nervous about Jean-Claude having you. The independents see you as either a threat or an opportunity. And Section 31 is very interested in having a conversation about what a demon from another dimension might be able to do for them. Section 31. Sesshomaru asked. Secret government organization. Dark operations. Not officially acknowledged but very real. They deal in things most people don't want to know about. Anita tapped the table. My point is, you're not just playing against individual factions anymore. You're playing against institutional power structures that have resources you can't even imagine. You need strategy, not just strength. Sesshomaru considered this. The woman was correct, which he disliked admitting. In his own world, he had built his power base over centuries, accumulating alliances and territories through careful combination of force and intelligence. But he had done so gradually, establishing himself as an authority that could not be challenged. Here. As they drove through St. Louis's nighttime streets, Sesshomaru felt the pieces of the game shifting around him. The rogue vampire attack wasn't random chance, it was a consequence of the power vacuum his arrival had created. Factions were testing boundaries, pushing at the established order, seeing if the newcomer represented opportunity or threat. By the time they arrived at Guilty Pleasures, the situation had already escalated past negotiation. Bodies lay scattered across the street outside the club, some vampire, some human, all of them dead or dying. Anita's expression was grim as she moved toward the chaos with her weapon drawn, gesturing for Sesshomaru to follow. Inside the club, Jean-Claude was fighting, actually physically fighting, against a rogue vampire with the bearing of someone ancient and dangerous. Richard's pack was engaged with the rogue's thralls. And in the shadows of the club, Sesshomaru sensed something else. A presence that didn't belong to any faction he'd yet encountered. Magic, dark and intentional, being woven through the violence like a thread binding fates together. A dark mage, Sesshomaru said to Anita. This attack is orchestrated. By who? Anita demanded, already moving to engage the rogue vampire directly. But Sesshomaru was already moving toward the source of the magic, his demonic power rising despite the city's interference. Whoever was pulling the strings of this attack was about to learn that orchestrating events without understanding all the variables was a fatal mistake. The question was, who had enough resources and intelligence to coordinate a move this complex? And more importantly, what was their endgame? The dark mage was hidden in the basement of Guilty Pleasures, in a chamber that reeked of blood magic and malevolent intention. Sesshomaru descended the stairs with Anita at his side, and immediately understood the scope of what they were facing. The mage had constructed a ritual circle of impressive complexity, human blood mixed with something else, something that made Sesshomaru's skin crawl despite his centuries of existence. Candles burned at cardinal points, their flames an unnatural violet. And at the center of the circle stood a woman in her 50s, her hands moving through intricate gestures while she chanted in a language that predated most modern civilizations. Step back, Sesshomaru said to Anita. This is not your fight. But even as he spoke, he realized the problem. The dark mage wasn't trying to bind him or control him, she was drawing power from the entire conflict happening above them. Every act of violence, every death, every moment of supernatural energy expended in the fighting was feeding into her ritual. She was using the factions against each other, using their own power as fuel for something far larger. The chanting intensified, and Sesshomaru felt it, a dimensional resonance, similar to the rift that had brought him to this world but far more controlled, far more intentional. His blood went cold as understanding crystallized. She was trying to open a permanent gateway. Stop her, Anita said, raising her weapon, but Sesshomaru was already moving. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his claws extended, his demonic aura flaring despite the interference that dampened his power. The dark mage looked up at him, her eyes filled with fanatic certainty. You don't understand, she hissed. The gateway must be opened. The old powers must return to this world. Your presence here has weakened the barriers. We can use you. Sesshomaru's claws passed through her throat, and she ceased speaking permanently. The ritual circle collapsed instantly. The magical construct crumbling into inert blood and ash. But the damage was already done. For a brief moment, before the gateway fully sealed, Sesshomaru felt the presence of something vast and ancient on the other side of the dimensional barrier. Something that had been trying to push through into this world for years. Something that had been waiting for an opportunity exactly like his arrival. Upstairs, the violence had reached a crescendo and was now beginning to stabilize. The rogue vampire, suddenly cut off from the power feeding his aggression, found himself overwhelmed by Jean-Claude and Richard's combined forces. He fell, not dead, because vampires were difficult to kill, but incapacitated, restrained, rendered harmless through the application of overwhelming force. When Sesshomaru and Anita emerged from the basement, the club was a scene of calculated devastation. Bodies were being removed. Damage was being assessed. And everyone, Jean-Claude, Richard, their respective subordinates, was staring at Sesshomaru with new understanding. You knew, Jean-Claude said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. You knew what she was attempting. I suspected, Sesshomaru replied. The dimensional resonance was consistent with an unauthorized gateway attempt. I could not allow it to succeed. Why? Richard asked, his eyes narrowed with predatory intelligence. What would you care about dimensional gateways? You want to go home. A permanent gateway might give you exactly what you want. That gateway was not intended for me, Sesshomaru said coldly. It was intended to allow something else to enter this world. Something far more dangerous than I am. Whatever she was calling to would have destabilized every faction in this city. The chaos would have been extensive. The implication hung in the air. He had prevented disaster not out of loyalty to Anita Blake or any faction, but because uncontrolled dimensional incursion threatened the stability he needed to survive and protect Rin. Anita's expression was calculating. You're telling me that wasn't random violence. That was someone deliberately trying to open a gateway, using the factions as power source. Correct. Do we have a name on the mage? Anita asked one of her officers, who had joined them in the club. Dead, the officer reported. The demon took her out. No identification on her body, but her ritual materials are ritualistic in nature, very old magic. Might take time to trace it. Anita turned back to Sesshomaru. This is bigger than faction politics, isn't it? This is someone deliberately trying to destabilize the entire city. Yes. Who? Sesshomaru didn't answer immediately. He was thinking through the implications. A dark mage with the knowledge and resources to construct a dimensional gateway. The ability to coordinate with a rogue vampire. The intelligence to understand that his arrival had weakened the barriers between worlds. This wasn't random crime. It was orchestrated instability. I do not know yet, he finally said. But I intend to find out. Jean-Claude and Richard exchanged a glance. In that moment, their factional rivalry seemed to pale in comparison to the larger threat. We should collaborate, Jean-Claude said carefully. Share information. The Vampire Council has resources that might help identify who organized this. As do we, Richard added. Whatever is happening, it affects all of us equally. It was a proposal Sesshomaru would have rejected hours earlier. But the encounter with the dark mage had crystallized something in his thinking. The gateway attempt had been sophisticated enough to suggest institutional backing. A single dark mage, no matter how talented, couldn't coordinate something this complex without resources and information. Someone had funded her. Someone had provided her with the knowledge of his arrival. Someone was using the supernatural factions as chess pieces in a larger game. I will accept temporary alliance. For investigative purposes, Sesshomaru said. But understand this, my priority is the safety of Rin and identifying the source of this threat. Factional interests are secondary. Fair enough, Anita said. She was already on her phone, calling for additional resources, setting up a coordination center at RPIT headquarters. We'll pool information. Vampires, shapeshifters, federal resources, and your particular expertise. If someone's trying to destabilize this city through dimensional incursions, we need to stop them before they try again. Over the next hours, an unprecedented collaboration took shape. Jean-Claude provided records of the rogue vampire's background. He had been approached by someone offering information about Sesshomaru, offered money and resources in exchange for creating chaos at a specific time. Richard's pack began investigating the Dark Mage's known associates, tracking her movements over the past week, trying to determine where she'd acquired her materials and knowledge. Anita worked her federal contacts, pulling records on dimensional research, gateway theory, anything that might indicate who had the expertise and resources to fund such an operation. But it was Sesshomaru who made the critical connection. He was meditating in the RPIT headquarters late that night, attempting to attune himself to the dimensional resonances still lingering from the gateway attempt, when he felt it. A signature. A specific magical pattern that was familiar in ways he couldn't immediately identify. It took him several hours to place it, but when he did, the realization hit with the force of a physical blow. The magic bore the signature of Section 31. Not the Dark Mage alone. The Dark Mage had been funded, equipped, and directed by the same government organization that Anita had warned him about. They had deliberately orchestrated the incident to accomplish something specific, gather information about his capabilities, observe how the factions would respond to crisis, and test whether dimensional gateways could be reliably opened with him as a catalyst point. It was calculated. It was cold. And it was far more dangerous than simple factional rivalry. When he presented this conclusion to Anita the following morning, she was not surprised. I suspected, she said grimly. Section 31 has been interested in preternatural assets for years. They see you as potential leverage, either to control or to weaponize. The question is, what do they want to actually accomplish? That is the critical question, Sesshomaru agreed. And the answer will determine what response is necessary. The collaboration between Jean-Claude, Richard, and Anita continued, but now it had taken on a different character. They were no longer just investigating a threat, they were preparing for a confrontation with an organization that had the resources and authority of the federal government behind it. Rin found Sesshomaru on the rooftop of their safe house that evening, looking out over the city. She was getting better at understanding the danger they were in, even if she didn't fully grasp the implications. Sesshomaru, are we going to have to fight the government people? Perhaps, he said, and he placed a hand on her head. But if we do, we will not face them alone. Anita Blake has chosen to ally with us. That is significant. Will that be enough? Rin asked. Sesshomaru looked out at the sprawling city, at the lights and traffic, the endless movement of millions of lives intersecting in complex patterns. I do not know, he said honestly. But I intend to ensure that it is. The confrontation with Section 31 came not through direct confrontation but through subterfuge and political maneuvering that Sesshomaru found almost more confusing than outright combat. It began with a visit from a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who presented herself at RPIT headquarters with federal credentials and a proposal that sounded reasonable on its surface. She was slight, middle-aged, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the cold precision of a researcher who viewed living beings as variables to be measured. We simply want to understand you, Dr. Chen said, sitting across from Sesshomaru in an interview room while Anita observed from behind one-way glass. Your physiology, your abilities, the nature of dimensional rifts. This knowledge could be invaluable in protecting this country from supernatural threats. You want to weaponize me, Sesshomaru said flatly. We want to understand you, Dr. Chen repeated, her tone not changing. Whether that understanding leads to weaponization is a separate question. What we know is that you represent a unique opportunity. A being from another dimension, with power that defies conventional explanation, now present in our world. That is not something we can simply ignore. I am not interested in becoming a variable in your organization's experiments. That's a pity, Dr. Chen said. Because we have information that you might find valuable. Information about the dark mage who attempted the gateway. Information about who funded her. Information that might help you find your way home. It was a masterfully constructed offer, dangling the possibility of returning to his own world while making refusal seem irrational. But Sesshomaru had not survived centuries of political maneuvering without learning to recognize manipulation. I will accept the information, he said. But not in exchange for cooperation with your organization. Dr. Chen smiled without warmth. I was hoping you'd say that, actually. Because it gives me the opportunity to explain what happens when you refuse federal cooperation. What followed was a carefully constructed presentation of consequences. Section 31 had resources that could be brought to bear, not just against Sesshomaru, but against Rin. Legal custody proceedings. Accusations of kidnapping, since Sesshomaru had technically abducted a child from a medieval Japanese village centuries ago. Medical testing authorized under emergency protocols. A slow, grinding campaign of institutional pressure that would separate them and undermine his position. You're threatening the child, Sesshomaru said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I'm explaining reality, Dr. Chen replied. You exist in a legal gray area. You have no citizenship, no documentation, no official status beyond preternatural entity. The child does exist in legal records, we have traced her origins, incidentally. She could be placed in protective custody quite easily. Whether you ever see her again would depend on your level of cooperation. The rage that rose in Sesshomaru was primal and absolute. His claws extended. His demonic aura flared, and despite the city's electromagnetic interference, it was powerful enough to shatter the light fixtures in the room. Alarms began to sound. But he didn't attack. That was what Dr. Chen wanted. Justification for physical restraint, for magical binding, for taking Rin into custody as a protective measure. Instead, Sesshomaru forced himself to breathe, to pull his power back inward, to think. If you harm her, he said quietly, I will kill everyone in your organization. I will hunt them across this country and beyond. I will make their deaths slow enough that they beg for mercy. And when I am finished with them, I will ensure that no one remembers they ever existed. This is not a threat. This is a promise. Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered, a moment of genuine uncertainty. She had confronted many preternatural beings, but she had never confronted one willing to sacrifice everything, including his own freedom, for the safety of someone else. I will convey your position to my superiors, she said, standing. But understand, they are not going to let you remain uncontrolled in this city. One way or another, you will cooperate. After she left, Anita emerged from the observation room, her expression carefully neutral. You played that well, she said. Showing rage controlled by will. That's what they're afraid of, not mindless violence, but calculated fury. They will move against Rin, Sesshomaru said. I need her relocated. Somewhere they cannot reach. Already thinking ahead, Anita said. I've got a safe house, actually several safe houses. We'll move her somewhere Section 31 doesn't have access. You'll stay here, visible, continuing to cooperate with our investigations. It'll buy us time to figure out a longer-term solution. But the problem ran deeper than simple relocation. Over the next 48 hours, the pieces of Section 31's strategy became clear through collaborative investigation between Anita, Jean-Claude, and Richard. The organization had been monitoring dimensional anomalies for years, theorizing that a significant incursion was coming. Sesshomaru's arrival had been unexpected, but it had also been an opportunity. Proof that dimensional crossing was possible, evidence that the barriers between worlds were weakening. More troublingly, Section 31 had identified a pattern in the dimensional disturbances. They weren't random. They were increasing in frequency and intensity, suggesting that something large was deliberately trying to force its way through from the other side. The Dark Mage was part of a larger network, Jean-Claude explained, reviewing the files that Anita's federal connections had managed to acquire. Multiple operatives, strategically placed, working toward the same goal. The gateway attempt was not an isolated incident. It was a test. A preliminary attempt to gauge the feasibility of permanent dimensional opening. They're preparing for something, Richard added grimly. Something big enough that they're willing to risk destabilizing the entire supernatural ecosystem in this city to prepare for it. Sesshomaru absorbed this information, and the implications were staggering. He had fled to this world from a dimensional rift, thinking himself the victim of circumstance. But what if his arrival had been observed? What if the dimensional tear that had brought him here had been deliberately observed, studied, weaponized? I need to speak to the thing on the other side of the barrier, Sesshomaru said abruptly. Anita stared at him. That's insane. We barely contained the gateway the first time. You want to deliberately open another one? Controlled contact, Sesshomaru replied. I sensed a presence when the Dark Mage's ritual collapsed. Something ancient. Something aware. If it is deliberately attempting to enter this world, I need to understand its motivations and capabilities. That's suicide, Richard said flatly. Perhaps. But ignorance is more dangerous. It took 2 days of negotiation. Anita using her federal authority to secure a location, Jean-Claude and Richard providing magical support and protective barriers, and Sesshomaru preparing himself mentally for the possibility of direct confrontation with an entity he couldn't predict or control. The ritual was conducted in an abandoned warehouse on the industrial side of St. Louis, far from populated areas. If something went wrong, the damage would be contained. Anita had brought in a priest. A man named Father Donnelly who specialized in spiritual protection, and several other preternatural consultants with expertise in dimensional work. Sesshomaru stood at the center of a protective circle inscribed with symbols designed to contain and limit whatever manifested. He had meditated for hours, preparing his mind and spirit for contact with something fundamentally alien. When he opened the doorway, not through ritual or magic, but through sheer force of will, pressing against the dimensional barrier itself, the presence on the other side was immediate and overwhelming. It was not a single entity. It was many entities, pressed against the barrier like water against a dam, trying to force through. And at the center of them, orchestrating their efforts, was an intelligence so vast and ancient that it made even Sesshomaru's centuries of existence feel like an eye blink. Welcome home, it said, and the words came not through sound but through direct transfer of meaning directly into his consciousness. We have been waiting for so long. Sesshomaru's mental barriers nearly shattered from the impact. What are you? We are the first. We are what walked this world before your world was separated from ours. We are what your kind calls demon, but older. Hungrier. We have been trapped on the other side of the dimensional barrier for millennia, watching your world flourish, waiting for the moment when the boundaries would weaken. Your arrival has caused that weakening. The barrier thins with every moment you remain in this world. Soon, very soon, we will be able to return home. Understanding crystallized in Sesshomaru's mind with terrible clarity. His presence in this world wasn't incidental to Section 31's plans. It was essential to them. Somehow, the organization had known that his arrival would weaken the dimensional barriers. They had been preparing for this moment, orchestrating events to maximize the incursion opportunity. But the more pressing question was, what did the first want? What would happen if beings of that age and power returned to his world? And more critically, could they be stopped? You plan to invade my world, Sesshomaru said. We plan to reclaim what was taken from us, the first replied. Your world was ours once. Humanity drove us back, sealed the barriers, imprisoned us on the other side. Now the seals are failing. Now we return. And you, little demon lord, have opened the door. The connection severed, and Sesshomaru collapsed to his knees, gasping. Anita was at his side instantly, her weapon drawn, scanning for threats that guns could never harm. What happened? She demanded. What did you contact? War, Sesshomaru said, his voice hollow. We are about to face war the likes of which this world has never known. And it will be my fault. The revelation of the first's existence and intention triggered a response that reverberated through every level of St. Louis's supernatural hierarchy and the human government beyond it. Within hours, an emergency council had formed, unprecedented in its composition. Anita Blake represented federal authority and RPIT. Jean-Claude and the Vampire Council brought centuries of strategic knowledge and resources. Richard's shapeshifter pack provided numbers and territorial intelligence. And Sesshomaru stood at the center, bearing the responsibility for a catastrophe he hadn't knowingly caused but couldn't deny contributing to. We need to close the dimensional barrier permanently, one of Anita's consultants, a woman named Marjorie who specialized in dimensional theory, explained, spreading documents across the table. But it's more complex than it sounds. The barrier wasn't constructed artificially. It's a natural phenomenon, a consequence of how the two dimensions relate to each other. Trying to reinforce it without understanding its fundamental nature could destabilize both realities. Can we reinforce it with what we know? Jean-Claude asked. Theoretically, yes. But we'd need a power source equivalent to whatever created the original barrier. That means we'd need something of immense preternatural magnitude. Marjorie's eyes turned toward Sesshomaru. Something like a being from the other side. Or a being of sufficient power from this side. The implication was clear and uncomfortable. Closing the barrier might require a sacrifice, someone of power sufficient to anchor the dimensional seal. Sesshomaru understood immediately that he was the obvious candidate. But before he could voice acceptance of that reality, something else happened. Rin appeared at the safe house where she'd been relocated, despite every precaution Anita had taken to keep her hidden. She simply walked through the door as if the locks and magical wards meant nothing, her small hand gripping something. That made Sesshomaru's breath catch. A fragment of the Shirkan jewel. Sesshomaru, she said, her voice carrying an unusual clarity, as if something beyond her consciousness was speaking through her. I found this. It was calling to me. I think it's trying to help. The Shirkan fragment glowed with soft pink light, and Sesshomaru felt his connection to his own world strengthen instantly. The electromagnetic interference that had damped his power for weeks suddenly seemed less absolute. His regeneration, which had been sluggish, felt nearly restored. Rin, he said carefully. How did you find this? I don't know, she replied, looking confused. I was sleeping, and I dreamed about it. And when I woke up, I just knew where it was. In a place I'd never been. Under the city, in the old tunnels beneath the streets. Jean-Claude and Anita exchanged a loaded glance. The tunnels beneath St. Louis connect to points of dimensional weakness, Jean-Claude said slowly. Places where the barrier between worlds is thinner. If the Shirkan fragment was calling to her. Then it's not random, Sesshomaru finished. The Shirkan jewel fragments scattered across dimensions when it was destroyed in my world. Some of them came here. And they're actively responding to the dimensional instability. Marjorie moved to examine the fragment, being careful not to touch it directly. This is remarkable. This is a focused concentration of dimensional anchor energy. If we had more of these fragments, we could use them to stabilize the barrier without requiring a sacrifice. We could close the gateway permanently. How many fragments are there? Richard asked. In my world, the Shirkan jewel was destroyed when it was purified, Sesshomaru explained. The fragments scattered across multiple dimensions as a consequence. How many came to this world, I do not know. But if Rin can sense them, then we use her as a catalyst, Anita said. She finds the fragments. We collect them. We use them to reinforce the dimensional barrier. But Sesshomaru understood the danger immediately. If Rin was sensitive to the Shirkan fragments, then the first would sense her sensitivity as well. She would become a target, a beacon drawing their attention toward her specifically. No, he said flatly. Using Rin as a locator makes her a liability. It's the only option we have, Marjorie countered. Without more fragments, we can't close the barrier. And without closing the barrier, the first will eventually force their way through. The problem was a perfect bind. Use Rin to find the fragments and risk her safety. Refuse to use her and risk the entire world. Sesshomaru looked at the child, seeing the weight of destiny settling onto her small shoulders in a way that made his preternatural anger flare. There has to be another way, he said. It was Jean-Claude who provided it, drawing on centuries of experience with impossible situations. We don't send Rin alone, he said. We send her protected. Heavily protected. A team of the strongest fighters we have, all bound together by magic and purpose. We make her a walking fortress rather than bait. And we make the retrieval aggressive, not passive, Richard added. We go into the tunnels as a combat force, ready for whatever the first sends to stop us. We take the fight to them instead of waiting for them to come to us. What followed was logistics on a scale that Sesshomaru had never encountered. Anita mobilized federal resources, not openly, but through careful coordination with contacts who owed her favors and understood what was at stake. Jean-Claude brought vampires of considerable age and power. Richard assembled his strongest shapeshifters, warriors who had fought in pack wars and emerged victorious. And Sesshomaru, for the first time since arriving in this world, began to restore his full power. The medallion that Rin carried, a spiritual anchor from his world, reacted to the Shirkan fragment she held. It began to channel power directly to him, strengthening his demonic aura, clearing away the electromagnetic interference that had clouded his senses for weeks. By the time the expedition was ready to move into the tunnels beneath St. Louis, Sesshomaru was operating at nearly 95% of his full capacity. The tunnels were extensive and old, clearly predating the modern city built above them. Sesshomaru could feel the dimensional weakness that Jean-Claude had mentioned. Places where the barriers between worlds grew thin, where the fabric of reality became almost permeable. And he could feel the First's presence pushing against those weak points, testing their strength, probing for entry vectors. Rin walked at the center of the group, surrounded by protection. Sesshomaru led the advance, his light whip coalescing in his hand, not weakened by the dimensional interference anymore, but strong and stable. Behind him came Anita with her weapons, Jean-Claude with 3 ancient vampires, and Richard with a dozen of his strongest pack members. The first manifestation came in the form of creatures that weren't quite physical, echoes of the First's presence, trying to take form in a world that hadn't yet fully welcomed them. They were nightmarish, chimeric, bearing features of demons and monsters that Sesshomaru recognized from ancient legends he'd thought long forgotten. The battle was brutal and swift. Sesshomaru's light whip carved through the manifestations. Anita's weapons proved surprisingly effective against creatures made partially of energy. The vampires and shapeshifters provided overwhelming force, their centuries or decades of combat experience translating into coordinated violence that left nothing alive. But with each manifestation they destroyed, more pressed forward. It became clear that the First was testing their strength, sending progressively more powerful echoes to gauge their capabilities. They're getting stronger, Richard said, blood streaking his transformed face as they pressed deeper into the tunnels. And there are more of them. They're learning from every encounter, Jean-Claude added. Adapting. The first is intelligent and it learns quickly. Sesshomaru understood the problem. Every moment they spent fighting was a moment the first used to gather more information, to strengthen its connection to this world. They needed to accelerate the operation, find the remaining Shirkan fragments, and close the barrier before the first could establish a permanent foothold. Rin, he called. Which direction? The child pointed deeper into the tunnels, toward a section that radiated power so intense that even the non-preternatural members of their group could feel it. It was there that they found the cache. Not just fragments of the Shirkan jewel, but an entire section of tunnel that served as a dimensional nexus point. And there, at the center of that nexus, stood a figure that made Sesshomaru's blood go cold. It was himself. Or rather, a manifestation of himself from the first's perspective, a version of him corrupted, darkened, twisted by centuries of exposure to the first's influence. This was what the first imagined he could become, what they wanted him to become. A gateway, a willing door through which they could enter his world. I am what you will be, the corrupted manifestation said, and its voice was Sesshomaru's voice but wrong, distorted by alien presence. When you finally accept that you cannot protect the child, when you finally understand that your will alone is insufficient, you will accept our offer. You will become us. And through you, we will return home. Sesshomaru felt the weight of that possibility settle over him like a shroud. The manifestation was not entirely wrong. There were points at which he had questioned whether his power would be enough, whether his determination could overcome the forces arrayed against them. But he had learned something in this world that he had never fully grasped in his own, that strength alone was not sufficient. That sometimes, power required community, required the willingness to accept help from others, required the kind of vulnerability that direct action couldn't overcome. No, Sesshomaru said, and his voice carried the certainty of absolute conviction. I will not become what you offer. I will not be your gateway. I will be your barrier. His light whip extended, and this time it didn't shimmer with uncertainty or diminishment. It was fully empowered, burning with the energy that came from his own will reinforced by the Shirkan fragments Rin had gathered. The corrupted manifestation tried to fight back, but it was a shadow compared to the real thing, an echo given form without substance. It dissolved under the force of his attack. And in its place, the tunnel revealed what it had been hiding. A device, ancient and complex, that appeared to be a lock mechanism for the dimensional barrier itself. The Shirkan fragments gravitated toward it instinctively, drawn by an affinity that Sesshomaru recognized as part of the jewel's original design. Rin walked to the device and placed the fragment she carried into a receptacle designed specifically to receive it. The other fragments, scattered throughout the cache, moved of their own accord, settling into place like a puzzle finally being solved. Light flooded the tunnels, and Sesshomaru felt the dimensional barrier seal itself with a finality that resonated through his very soul. The presence of the first didn't vanish, it was still there, still pressing against the barrier from the other side, but it was contained now, locked behind walls that would hold for centuries. When the light faded, the expedition stood in tunnels that suddenly felt less threatening, less alive with alien presence. Is it done? Anita asked, checking her team for injuries. Yes, Sesshomaru said. The barrier is sealed. They are contained. For how long? Jean-Claude asked. Long enough, Sesshomaru replied. Long enough for this world to prepare. Long enough for defenses to be established. But know this, the first will not stop trying. This is merely a delay, not a permanent solution. As they made their way back to the surface, Rin took Sesshomaru's hand. We're going to have to stay here, aren't we? We can't go home. Sesshomaru looked down at the child and understood the truth of what she was saying. The gateway home had been dependent on the dimensional instability. Now that the barrier was sealed, that pathway was gone, closed off as thoroughly as any door locked from the other side. He was no longer in a world between worlds. He was here. Permanently. The aftermath of sealing the dimensional barrier left St. Louis in a state of careful reorganization. The threat of immediate incursion was over, but the revelation of what lurked on the other side of dimensional walls had fundamentally altered how the supernatural factions understood their world. Sesshomaru found himself in a strange new position, neither outsider nor resident, but something between. He had saved the city and its various factions from catastrophe, but he had also irrevocably severed his connection to his own world in the process. The gateway home had been a possibility only as long as dimensional instability persisted. Now, with the barrier sealed and stabilized, that possibility had ceased to exist. It was a loss he had not fully processed until Rin asked him about it directly. They were sitting on the rooftop of a building that Anita had helped them secure. Not a safe house anymore, but something more permanent. A place that was becoming, slowly and reluctantly, a home. Do you regret it? Rin asked. Sealing the barrier? You chose me over going back to your world. I chose preventing catastrophe over personal preference, Sesshomaru corrected, though the distinction was subtle. But no. I do not regret it. Your safety is worth more than any world. It was not the kind of sentiment he would have expressed centuries ago, before Rin entered his life. The Sesshomaru of old would have found such statement weakness. But the Sesshomaru who had navigated St. Louis's supernatural politics, who had learned to value alliance and community over pure dominance, understood that some forms of power transcended physical strength. The integration process that followed was pragmatic and surprisingly smooth, given the complexities involved. Anita Blake officially brought Sesshomaru into Rapid's structure as a consultant on preternatural threats, particularly those with dimensional origin. It was a position that gave him legal standing, federal authority, and official protection that no faction could easily challenge. Jean-Claude and the Vampire Council proposed a formal non-aggression pact, which Sesshomaru accepted with the understanding that it was a mutual arrangement between equals, not subordination to vampire authority. The Vampire Lord seemed to respect this distinction, and an interesting dynamic developed, competitive but civil, with clear boundaries that both understood and respected. Richard's shapeshifter pact presented a more complex situation. The Ulfic offered Sesshomaru a position within the pact structure itself, a formal acknowledgement of his preternatural status and pack-adjacent nature. Sesshomaru declined full membership but accepted a position as an outside ally, someone the pack could call upon in times of need, in exchange for similar support if circumstances required it. You don't want to join us? Richard asked when Sesshomaru explained his position. I am not a shapeshifter, Sesshomaru replied simply. And I am not interested in submitting to pack hierarchy. But I am willing to maintain alliance with you as one leader recognizes another. Richard studied him for a long moment, then smiled. Fair enough. I respect that more than I would respect false membership anyway. The city's independent factions were more difficult to manage. Rogue vampires, dark mages, hunters, and various other operators who existed outside the established structure viewed Sesshomaru as either opportunity or threat depending on their disposition. There were conflicts, some resolved through negotiation, some through demonstrated force. Sesshomaru learned that in this world, reputation was as important as actual capability. By the time a few months had passed, the consensus among St. Louis's supernatural underworld was that challenging Sesshomaru was a path to extinction. But the most significant change came in Sesshomaru's relationship with Rin and what it meant for both of them. She was no longer a child alone in an alien world. She had developed friendships with other humans connected to the supernatural community. She attended a school that Anita had helped her enroll in, a place where her unusual background could be explained away as parental eccentricity and foreign upbringing. She was learning to navigate modern society with a resilience that Sesshomaru found remarkable. And she had stopped asking when they could go home. One evening, about 6 months after sealing the dimensional barrier, Rin came to him with a question that suggested her thinking had evolved considerably. Sesshomaru, what if we are home now? What if this is where we're supposed to be? He didn't answer immediately. He was considering the philosophical depth of what she was asking. Home was a concept he had always understood as place, the Western lands, the territory that bore his name and acknowledged his authority. But what Rin was suggesting was that home might be a state of being rather than a location. That the people you were with, the life you built, the connections you established, these might constitute home in ways that geography could not. Perhaps you are correct, he said finally. Perhaps we have found a new home. But acceptance did not mean the past was forgotten or the future without complications. Section 31 remained a persistent problem. Dar. Sarah Chen had backed off from direct confrontation after the dimensional barrier sealing. It was difficult to maintain a position of authority over someone who had just prevented dimensional invasion, but she hadn't disappeared. Her organization continued to monitor Sesshomaru, continued to study the implications of his presence in their world, continued to develop contingency plans for scenarios involving preternatural incursion. Anita warned him about this regularly. They're not going away, she said during one of their routine check-ins. They'll always be trying to find leverage. It's what they do. The best you can do is stay aware and stay connected to people who can help defend you if they make a move. Sesshomaru had come to understand that in this world, defense meant more than martial capability. It meant political connection, legal standing, allies with authority and resources. It meant being too integrated into the city's structure to be removed without causing disruption that the government wanted to avoid. It was a different kind of power than he had wielded in his own world, and he was still learning to navigate it with full competence. The Shirkan fragments that had been used to seal the dimensional barrier were secured in a vault designed specifically for containing preternatural artifacts. Marjorie, the dimensional specialist, continued to study them, theorizing about their origin and purpose. She approached Sesshomaru one day with a discovery that resonated with deeper implications. The fragments are connected to you, she explained, showing him readings that meant little to him but which she seemed to find significant. More specifically, they're responding to your presence. When you're near them, their resonance frequency increases. I think they might be attuned to you specifically. Which means the Shirkan jewel, when it was whole, might have had some connection to your bloodline or origin. That is not possible, Sesshomaru said automatically. But even as he spoke, he was reviewing centuries of his own history, trying to remember if there had ever been mention of connection to the Shirkan jewel or its origin. I'm just telling you what the data shows, Marjorie said. Make of it what you will. The implication was unsettling, that his arrival in this world might not have been random chance but something more deliberate, more connected to his fundamental nature. But investigating that possibility would require returning to his own world, which was no longer possible, which meant it was a mystery that might never be solved. He brought this up with Jean-Claude one evening, and the ancient vampire listened with the patience of someone who had encountered countless temporal and mystical paradoxes over centuries of existence. Some questions are not meant to be answered, Jean-Claude said philosophically. Sometimes the knowing of the question is all we receive. You are here. Rin is safe. The dimensional barrier is sealed. Whatever brought you here, whatever the nature of that connection, it has resulted in a positive outcome for everyone involved. Sometimes that must be enough. But it wasn't the acceptance Sesshomaru sought. It was resignation to uncertainty, and that was something he had never been comfortable with. Still, the months continued their progression, and Sesshomaru found himself settling into a rhythm that he would never have anticipated or desired but which, upon reflection, was not entirely disagreeable. He worked with Anita on cases involving preternatural threats. He maintained careful diplomatic relations with the Vampire Council, the Shapeshifter Pack, and the city's other factions. He watched Rin grow and adapt and begin to dream about futures that didn't involve going home to a world that no longer contained her. He established a life in a city and world that had been completely foreign to him not long ago. One evening, walking through downtown St. Louis with Rin, watching the city lights reflect off the Mississippi River, he realized something that surprised him. he was no longer thinking about his own world. He was no longer calculating ways to return home. He was no longer the outsider waiting for rescue from this alien realm. He had become a part of St. Louis's supernatural ecosystem in ways that transcended simple integration or strategic alliance. He had become woven into the fabric of this city's power structure, necessary to its continued stability, recognized as an authority in his own right. The demon lord of the Western lands had become something new. A resident of St. Louis, a federal consultant, an ally to vampires and shapeshifters, a guardian of a child who was learning to see this strange new world as her own. Sesshomaru, Rin said, tugging on his sleeve. "Look. They're lighting the arch. It's beautiful." He looked. The gateway arch was indeed impressive, a monument to human ambition and engineering. Not something that existed in his world. Not something he could have imagined before arrival. But it was here, and Rin saw beauty in it, and that was enough. "Yes," he said. "It is beautiful." They stood together in the St. Louis night, watching the city pulse with life and power and endless possibility. And for the first time since his arrival, Sesshomaru allowed himself to believe that perhaps this was not the life he had planned, but it was the life he had been given. And that would have to be enough. Conclusion. The first year in St. Louis taught Sesshomaru a fundamental truth that his centuries in the Western lands had never quite crystallized: power without connection is merely potential. In his own world, he had been the most powerful being in his territory, and that power had been sufficient. His will became law because none could challenge it. His decisions shaped entire regions because he possessed the strength to enforce them. But in this world, strength alone meant nothing without understanding, without alliance, without the willingness to operate within systems he did not create and could not unilaterally control. The dimensional barrier had forced him to learn this lesson through necessity. Sealing it had required him to accept help, to work alongside creatures he would have once dismissed as beneath consideration, to recognize that his own power was insufficient for the challenges he faced. That realization had changed him in ways that went beyond mere adaptation. Rin had thrived in St. Louis in ways Sesshomaru hadn't anticipated. She attended school, made friends, developed interests in music and art and history. She still remembered the old world, still cherished the memories of their time together before the dimensional rift, but she no longer mourned the loss of it. She had discovered that growing was more important than preservation, that the future could hold unexpected joys even if the path to it was not the one she would have chosen. The supernatural community of St. Louis had, against all logic and precedent, accepted Sesshomaru as something approaching an authority figure. Not a leader in the traditional sense, he held no formal position in any faction's hierarchy. But as a voice that carried weight, an outside perspective that could break deadlocks, a power that could be called upon when circumstances exceeded the capability of the established structures. Section 31 remained a persistent concern, but one that had evolved into manageable complexity rather than existential threat. Dr. Sarah Chen had been replaced by a new liaison, a man named Director Morrison, who seemed to understand that Sesshomaru could not be controlled and could only be managed through mutual benefit and careful respect of boundaries. The arrangement was neither friendship nor alliance, but a working relationship born from acknowledgement that both parties had stakes in St. Louis's stability. The rogue factions, the independent operators, the dark mages, the hunters who saw preternatural beings as threats to be eliminated, had learned through painful experience that challenging Sesshomaru directly resulted in swift and absolute consequences. A certain equilibrium had been established. He did not hunt them unprovoked, but any movement toward destabilizing the city's supernatural balance met with immediate, overwhelming response. Jean-Claude had proven to be an interesting ally. The ancient vampire possessed both ruthlessness and a kind of pragmatic wisdom that transcended simple power dynamics. He and Sesshomaru had developed a relationship that approximated friendship, though neither would have used that term. It was more accurate to say they had learned to respect each other as beings operating at similar levels of capability and sophistication, each understanding the other's motivations without needing them to be explicitly stated. Richard's shapeshifter pack had stabilized under better leadership than it might have otherwise developed, partly because Richard had learned valuable lessons from observing how Sesshomaru navigated factional politics. The Wolf King was never going to be as cold or calculating as Jean-Claude, but he had developed a capacity for strategic thinking that made his pack more stable and his authority less contested. Anita Blake had become something approaching a friend, though Sesshomaru understood that friendship for her meant something different than it might for others. She valued competence, integrity, and clear communication above emotional bonding. She appreciated that Sesshomaru operated according to principle rather than convenience, even when those principles conflicted with her own interests. And she had proven willing to stand with him repeatedly when political pressure mounted, which in her world was the highest form of loyalty one could demonstrate. The dimensional barrier itself remained sealed, monitored constantly by a combination of RPIT resources and Sesshomaru's own periodic verification. The presence of the first continued to press against it, probing for weaknesses, testing for opportunities. But the Shirkan fragments, locked into the mechanism that anchored the barrier, held firm. Marjorie estimated that the seal would remain stable for at least 2 centuries before requiring reinforcement, assuming no new dimensional anomalies emerged to destabilize it. That estimation gave Sesshomaru considerable time to prepare contingencies, to build defenses, to ensure that if the first ever did manage to force their way through again, St. Louis, and the world beyond it, would be ready. The loss of his original world remained a complicated wound. Sesshomaru had come to understand that returning home had been a fantasy born from displacement, from the initial shock of finding himself in an alien reality. The truth was that his world no longer existed in any meaningful way for him. The territories he had ruled would have been reclaimed by other demons. The subordinates he had commanded would have pledged allegiance to stronger powers. Time moved differently on both sides of the dimensional barrier, and centuries might have passed in the world he had left behind. There was no home to return to, only an abstract memory of a place that no longer was. So instead, he had built something new. A home constructed not from territorial dominion but from relationships and mutual obligation. A place where power meant something different, where it was measured not just in capability but in influence, not just in strength but in wisdom, not just in individual mastery but in the capacity to inspire loyalty and cooperation. Rin would grow up in this world. She would make choices about her own future that Sesshomaru could not predict or control. She might become connected to the supernatural community in a formal way, or she might choose to remain human and independent. Either path was acceptable to him now, where once he would have demanded control over her future. That surrender of absolute control was perhaps the greatest change Dimensional Crossing had wrought in him. As he stood on the rooftop of their building one evening, watching the sun set over St. Louis's sprawling landscape, Sesshomaru reflected on the trajectory that had brought him here. Pursuit of a rogue demon had led to Dimensional Rift. Dimensional Rift had led to displacement and vulnerability. Vulnerability had led to forced cooperation and discovery of alliance. Alliance had led to building community and establishing new purpose. The path had not been one he would have chosen. The result was not what he had anticipated. But standing here, in a city that had become familiar, with a child who had become his greatest priority, with a position of meaningful authority and respected standing, he understood that sometimes the life one was given was better than the life one had planned. Rin came to join him on the rooftop, as she often did in the evenings. She was growing taller, her features becoming more defined, her eyes seeing the world with increasing sophistication. Soon she would be a young woman. After that, an adult. Her own person, making her own choices, living her own life. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, standing beside him and looking out at the city. "That home is not a place," Sesshomaru replied. "That it is something we build through time and choice and commitment." "Are you happy here?" Rin asked. It was a question that would have confused him a year ago. Happiness was not something demons of his stature typically concerned themselves with. But he had learned through living in this world that emotions mattered, that contentment was a valid state of being, that satisfaction in one's existence was worth pursuing. "Yes," he said. "I believe I am." And in that moment, as the St. Louis sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, as the city's lights began to flicker on in the gathering darkness, as Rin's small hand found his and held it with the trust of someone who had learned that he would never let her fall, Sesshomaru understood that dimensional crossing had given him something far more valuable than he had lost. It had given him the opportunity to become something other than a lord. To become a guardian. To become part of a community. To become, in the fullest sense of the word, home for someone who needed one. The barriers between worlds remained sealed, the first locked away on the other side, the threats contained and managed. But the barriers between Sesshomaru and the world he now inhabited had dissolved completely. He was no longer the outsider waiting for rescue. He was no longer the demon lord of the western lands. He was simply Sesshomaru, resident of St. Louis, consultant to RPIT, ally to the city's various factions, and most importantly, guardian to a child who saw him not as a lord but as home. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Live long and prosper. More stories await.